This concern of changing society that we see in abolitionism was a part of a larger movement in the 19th century to transform society for the better in a variety of ways. And so as we move into culture and society, one of the main, I want to start with talking about what's often been referred to as the benevolent empire. For many Christians, especially evangelicals, true Christianity was expressed in social concern and activism. And so these Christians started a variety of organizations meant to address a variety of religious and social issues. I'll just give you some examples. There were many organizations that developed focused on religious education. Groups like the American Sunday School Union, the American Bible and Tract Society. And so it's in the late 18th and early 19th century that we see the development of Sunday schools. The Sunday school movement had started in England, and a lot of the focus in those early years was not on religious education as much as it was on reading, social skills, teaching kids hygiene and manners, largely because they were dealing with kids who, without the existence of child labor laws, were working throughout the week, and so they did not have the opportunity to develop some of these things, and so Christians were reaching out to try and impart some of these skills, thinking that as children become educated and enlightened, they will become Christians. And so the Bible for them was a textbook to a better life for a lot of these people starting Sunday schools. It's not as much about how it is today, spiritual formation, right? Encouraging and nurturing children's spiritual growth. However, it develops that connotation as it transfers over to the United States, where you have that concern for educating children for salvation, spiritual formation. And eventually groups like the American Sunday School Union were developed to try and bring uniformity across denominations and keep everyone in different ages on the same lesson. So you have the development of Sunday school literature and other types of things. Other organizations developing this time, or as the influence of the benevolent empire, were groups like missionary societies, where people would pool their resources to send missionaries overseas. And Gonzalez talks about that kind of revival of missionary impulse in the late 1700s and early 1800s. Other societies were focused, or other groups were focused on moral reform, temperance, dealing with alcoholism, right, encouraging people to totally abstain from alcohol, or at least limit the amount of alcohol. Moral reform against prostitution, changing the conditions in jails, obscenities, getting rid of obscenity, Sabbath laws, right, restricting what could and couldn't be done on Sundays. You have the development of orphanages and hospitals, organizations like the YMCA, the YWCA, developing in Great Britain and eventually coming over to the United States. Even organizations like the Salvation Army, started by a man named William Booth in Great Britain. He became a Methodist minister in London in 1852 and began preaching to the poor and homeless out in the street. But some of his methods concerned the Methodist Church, and so eventually he withdraws from the church but continues to travel and to evangelize. Booth becomes quite popular as a preacher, but many of his converts are criminals, people with a questionable past. Right? These are the people drawn to him. His original intent was, as he's going out and preaching to these people, to have them experience conversion and then connect them with the church. Right? He's not out to start a new church. He's not out to start a new congregation. He's just out to preach, convert people, connect them with the church. But a lot of those converts from the lower parts of society weren't welcomed by other churches. They didn't want those people in their congregations. And so he decides he's going to have to start his own organization to address those people that need additional help. Originally it's called the Christian Mission, and it would gradually begin taking on employees who would help minister to the homeless, the poor, and others. Sometimes they were referred to as the Hallelujah Army, kind of derisively, but they did begin taking on this kind of notion of a army. Booth was referred to as the general. His wife Catherine was referred to as the mother of this organization. But gradually this institutional organizational framework began taking place. However, one thing that appears to be the case is how does it move from Christian Mission to Salvation Army? He's reading a report supposedly in 1878, and he noted the phrase that somebody had written, that the Christian Mission is a volunteer army. Booth is said to have crossed out the word volunteer and wrote in the word salvation. And so the name Salvation Army was born. They latched on to the idea of an army. They were God's army. And so the staff began wearing uniforms. They began using ranks. Eventually it would spread to the United States and to other countries throughout the world. All of this development, where's the term benevolent empire, right? It's a bunch of groups. Well, many of the organizations, like some of those, the American Sunday School Union, American Bible Tract Society, some of these other groups, often had directors on their various boards, right? That they were the director of this organization, this organization, this organization. The general meetings of these groups would be held together or close to the same time in New York so people could participate in more than one. So a lot of the leadership was interconnected. And so it was, in a sense, an empire with all these different societies, but one focused on benevolence, right? Trying to do something good in society. Questions about the benevolent empire? Unfortunately, right, there were other examples where Christianity was combined with other aspects. We don't have the time to talk about things like manifest destiny and this push toward the West and the sticking of Native Americans on reservations and other types of exhibitions of racism. But one of the things that becomes apparent toward the latter part of the 19th century is a growing concern of the indigenous foreigners, so to speak, as some have referred to Native Americans, but it was also concerns about the outward immigrants as well. More and more throughout the 19th century, there was a concern of what is going to happen to the Anglo-Saxon race in the United States as more and more people from non-Anglo-Saxon countries are continuing their immigration. And unfortunately, the triumph of the Anglo-Saxon race was often reflected in a variety of sermons in the writings in the middle of the end of the century of one of the most famous preachers of this time, Josiah Strong, preached this sermon in 1893 that was later published. But as you kind of look over it, you see his emphasis on the superiority of the Anglo-Saxon race. Strong said, "It seems to me that God, with infinite wisdom and skill, is here training the Anglo-Saxon race for an hour sure to come in the world's future. The time is coming when the pressure of population on the means of subsistence will be felt here as it is now felt in Europe and Asia." Right? So people are having struggles in Europe and Asia providing food. Well, a lot of them are coming over here, and so we're going to experience it as well. Then will the world enter on a new stage of history, the final competition of the races for which the Anglo-Saxon is being schooled. Remember, this is a minister preaching this. Long before the 1,000 millions are here, the mighty centrifugal tendency inherent in this stock and strengthened in the United States will assert itself. Then this race of unequaled energy, with all the majesty of numbers and the might of wealth behind it, the representative let us hope of the largest liberty, the purest Christianity, the highest civilization, having developed peculiarly aggressive traits calculated to impress its institutions upon mankind, will spread itself over the earth. All right? And so this notion of God and Anglo-Saxonism are intertwined, and God is preparing whites to conquer the world through their institutions as well as through Christianity. And unfortunately, Strong's views were representative of a lot of white Christians, especially in the United States. Despite Christianity starting in the Middle East, spreading to Africa and Asia, a lot of whites have combined Christianity with this assertion of the supremacy of a certain style of European heritage. And that fear, and sometimes we can even say hatred, didn't just focus against other races in the United States. Sometimes it was focused on any sort of other, even if they were, and maybe especially if they were, Catholic. And Catholics were coming to the United States during this time period in large numbers. In the early 19th century, there were around 80 Catholic churches, 70 priests, and about 70,000 Catholics. In 1865, so 50 years later, there were 3.5 million Catholics, making it the largest single denomination in the country. Yes, if you combined all the Protestants in the country, there were more Protestants than Catholics. But if you separated out Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians, Catholics were the largest group. They came from various regions and for various reasons. These were the main six during the 19th century that immigrated. The Irish, of course, come to the United States because of the potato famine. That question, everybody always knows the answer to that question, right? The potato famine. The German Catholics, as we talked about in the Culture Kampf back at the end of the Holy Roman Empire, they're coming because of persecution. The Catholics are. Other German Protestants are coming as well. Italian Catholics are coming to make their wealth. Right? There's not much land in Italy that isn't controlled, and so young Italian men would come over to the United States hoping to make their wealth, hoping to go back to Italy to buy land. The Polish also come because of persecution. French Canadians come for jobs. The Mexicans end up becoming United States citizens because of the end of the war with Mexico, and the borders redrawn, and then suddenly 500,000 Mexicans find themselves American citizens. And so they didn't really immigrate, they just suddenly found the border redrawn around them. All of them come with different conceptions of the church. And so among these different ethnic groups, each of them has their own view of Catholicism. Some of them come with strong loyalties to the church, the Irish. Some of them come with a lot of suspicion about the church. The Italians, for example, right? Because a lot of the Italians had been through the Catholic control of certain countries. Some supplemented their national identity with the Catholic one. There technically isn't a Poland in the middle of the 19th century because it's kind of divided up between the Austrians, the Germans, and the Russians. And so with the Polish not having their own country, their Catholicism becomes their nationalism. Right? So they come with their own views on what it means to be Catholic. Some are very tied to the church. Others are loosely tied to the church. Some, like the Germans, try to assimilate to the United States. Others, like the Italians, don't. Right? They want to maintain their particular ethnic identity. Often there's a lot of tension between the hierarchy, who end up being Irish, right? So a lot of the priests and the bishops, even into the 20th century, are Irish. And so there's tension between the Irish priests and bishops and groups like the Mexicans, who want to speak in Spanish, and they want to use some of the practices that they've been doing for centuries that are kind of this mixture between Catholicism and indigenous practices like the Dia de los Muertos, which was yesterday, the Day of the Dead. Well, there's Catholic aspects to that, and then there's some indigenous Native American aspects to that. Well, the Irish think that, that's just ridiculous. I mean, this is not Catholicism, right? So there's this back and forth between these groups. The key thing, though, in all of this is that despite all these differences, Protestants are afraid of all of them. There's great fear among Protestants of how Catholics are going to take over the United States. Many Protestants hated Catholicism, but were deeply fascinated by it. And by thinking that it was a terrible, horrible, dark, and alien world that was strangely compelling. It was about idolatry, right? People worshiping statues. It was about being childlike. It was secretive. Catholics were plotting to rule the world, is what Protestants thought. They had magical thinking. They were undemocratic and dangerous. They were obsessed with death and blood and flesh. And convent literature was an example of these anti-Catholic fears. Works like The Awful Disclosures of Maria Monk, written in 1836, becomes a bestseller and remains that way for a while. Essentially, this convent literature was supposedly about what really took place in convents among nuns. And these novels, I say because they're fiction, but they were presented as nonfiction, would be produced claiming to tell these stories. So, according to Maria Monk, some of the awful disclosures included the facts of priests and nuns not really being celibate. That the priest would have a secret tunnel into the convent, and nuns were expected at any point to give themselves sexually to the priests. Now, obviously, out of those unions, there would sometimes be children produced. What happened there? Well, the stories of Maria Monk were that the children would be baptized and then would be killed and dumped into a common pit. There are tales of coercion, conspiracy, and murder in The Awful Disclosures of Maria Monk. All of it's untrue. But this convent literature is presented as this is what Catholicism is really like for Protestants in the United States. And Maria Monk is not the only example of this. There's other documents written at the time as well. And so these tensions between Catholics and Protestants. Race and immigration weren't the only problems or only challenges facing Christianity in the 19th century. In fact, Christians, as mentioned already, found themselves in a world that was becoming more and more hostile to Christianity. Specifically Christianity's ability to explain reality. The slow break between science and Christianity in Europe opened the door for science to be done without any sort of ecclesiastical oversight and without ecclesiastical concern. Where previous generations had undertaken scientific endeavors for the glory of God or trying to understand how God worked in nature, more scientists were less concerned with these goals. Now, yes, there were still scientists trying to discover how God had done things, but there were fewer of them. More of them were just interested in science and progress. Furthermore, the Industrial Revolution also pushed Christians even further from a strong reliance on the church, whatever church that might be. The Industrial Revolution provided wealth and comfort that didn't exist previously, admittedly, often to a select few, but it required increased numbers of laborers. Well, that meant migration, right? People leaving to go to the cities. Well, that would lead to families being separated, the loss of extended family connections, and more of a focus on the individual. And so you have this kind of wealth gap and exploitation and more of a focus on the nuclear family rather than the extended family. Secularizing government in Europe, right? Governments that were moving away from a church, a state church. The United States' emphasis on secularism. And of course, eventually in Latin America, also divorced political power from church power. In 1859, Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, which had a significant impact on the Western world. Evolution and the concept of organisms evolving had existed prior to Darwin. People had been talking about evolution for centuries. But it was Darwin's promotion of how he believed evolution took place that really catches fire. Particularly the notion that environmental conditions had a significant impact on how species developed. Species that were more fit for an environment tended to be the ones to survive. And so those that had developed advantages to the environment would produce offspring that would have a better chance of survival, is essentially what natural selection theorized. Now, while Darwin, who had been trained in theology, that was his training, he personally gradually moved away from the notion that there was a creator God. But he didn't make this a significant part of what he was supposing about the development of the universe. And in fact, later on in his life, he would claim to be more agnostic than specifically atheist. But he also believed that one could be a theist, believe in God, and believe in evolution through natural selection. And because he didn't firmly espouse atheism or recommend people to become atheists, that allowed some Christians to develop this approach that incorporated naturalistic evolution with Christianity. Now, yes, there were a lot of Christians who rejected that notion and said if you follow Darwin's theory, it will lead to atheism, which is, I think is probably accurate. But often, there's this approach of trying to say, God was guiding the process of evolution, right? And so this is trying to mold these two. Darwin, in a later document, The Descent of Man, would postulate that human beings and apes had a common ancestor. And here's where the Protestants said, no. Right? We might be able to accept the whole God-guiding evolution, but the fact that we had a common ancestor with apes, no. We're a special creation by God. So while some of these Protestants would say, okay, we can believe in evolution, there was something specific that happened to human beings. God could allow other life forms to develop through natural selection, but human beings were different. This would allow those Protestants that supported natural selection to keep humans as the pinnacle of creation and to keep the doctrine of the soul as something unique to human beings. We'll talk in the 20th century about other Christians and how they approached this and said, if we accept this, this destroys the foundation of Christianity, its approach to reality. These two views are not compatible. We'll go ahead and finish there. On Thursday, we'll pick up and talk about how that development that began into the development of liberal Protestantism and how that is a development here in the 19th century. We'll talk